So in our second game, we want to see Mikhail Tal has he destroyed his opponents. Please remember that Mikhail Tal is this man from Riga, the Latvian capital, and then we see him as this is the 8th world chess champion. So Mikhail Tal in this game against this guy called Janis Mileka. He showed his brilliance with the black pieces. In the game we see d4, and then from this guy Janis, and Mikhail Tal responds the knight to f6. Very pretty standard, of course, the Indian defense. Then we see the move c4, and Mikhail replied with the Benoni. He loved the Benoni, he liked it. And then we see d5. d5 at this point, that's when we see the move e6. e6 is a brilliant move, which comes in with another response, pawn to g3. Of course, at this point, Mikhail chooses to take the center, and of course, Janis takes back with the pawn. Of course, we see a new form, the Benoni defense, a modern variation. Of course, we see him overextending with this pawn b5, and then we see on board the move a4. Of course, Tal just extends his pawn with move b4, and that's when we see on board b3. At this point, we see, of course, expecting this strike, as we expect this in these systems. Putting his bishop on g7 and also controlling that diagonal. On the board, we see bishop to g2, and that's when we see the pawn d6, of course, sealing up the center and reinforcing his center. And then we see the pawn coming in, pawn to e4. That's when we see bishop to g7. At this point, we see bishop to b2, and that's when Tal castles, and then Janis just opens up his pieces, goes with knight e2. And of course, we expect that rook. Of course, Tal liked also the activity of his pieces. He comes in with rook to e8, a very standard move. Then we see on the board knight to d2, and then we see the pawn take. This is a sacrifice, of course, but not really a true sacrifice, because of course we see the pawn, we see the bishop also exposed, and also these strikes in the center. That's when we see the bishop takes first, and then Mikhail Tal chooses to take with the knight. Of course, we see this bishop falling back to attack this knight. This knight is in imminent danger at this point. It really looks like Mikhail Tal has just lost a piece. But at this point, we see the bishop coming in with some force. Bishop coming in handy, of course, putting that knight on tension. At this point, that's when we see the bishop disconnecting the rook. Janis seems to have stolen a piece, or maybe let's say taken a piece for himself. He has these 3 pieces, but of course the knight looks very bad in the white camp. So Mikhail Tal, how is he going to save this knight? So we see on board Mikhail Tal throws in this check, which now really secures the knight. Of course, when you take, he takes. That's when we see this move takes, and that's when we see that Janis couldn't really take that piece so easily. And that's when we see the rook coming in. And then at this point, we see this knight to d7, and that's when we see queen to d2 coming in. And then we see Tal opening up his pieces with knight to f6. Everything is in the right place. All engines are ready to strike. And then we see the knight on f4. At this point, we see Tal chasing away that knight, and of course the knight falling back. At this moment, we can see, of course, that really Janis is really struggling for space. Janis is really being suffocated. Things are not good. Of course, we see this rook lift, of course, able to hold this, trying to hold this pawn. Let's note that you cannot pick the pawn because of the rook attack. So we see that Janis' father chooses to long castle, of course, trying to get away from that danger. That's when we see the knight coming in. Too much pressure on the board. Of course, the knight is really just enjoying all these pins and coming into the game very fast. The queen gets out of danger, but that's when we see the bishop. That's when we see the bishop taking the knight. Of course, we know that if queen takes the bishop, we see this rook coming in at this point. So of course the queen had to take, and that's when we see knight c3. Seeing knight c3, of course, this was a painful game for Janis. This is when he threw in the towel, and this was enough for the day. Thank you. See you in the next towel games as we enjoy this brilliant world champion, the 8th world champion, Mikhail Tal of